Ladies and gentlemen of Africa and the world, today I do not come to speak of kings who ruled with iron fists. I come to speak of a young man who stood with a spine of steel, a soldier not just of arms, but of vision. A leader not molded by global institutions, but forged by the fire of his people's pain. They did not see him coming, but when he arrived, they could not unsee him. He did not wait to grow old to grow bold. He rose not through betrayal, but through bravery, not through lies, but through loyalty, to his land, to his people, to the mother that is Africa. They fear him, not because he carries a gun, but because he carries an idea whose time has come. And that idea is simple. Africa must be free, Africa must be sovereign, and Africa must rise, now, not later. They fear this young leader because he dared to defy the puppet strings. They fear him because in an age where loyalty is bought and souls are sold for dollars and euros, he stood on principle. He dared to cut the strings that have bound Africa for decades. Strings invisible to the naked eye, but felt in every school that never got built, in every hospital without medicine, in every village where poverty has been normalized. He saw through the smile of the colonizer who had merely changed costumes. He recognized that what had changed was the language of control, no longer chains of steel but contracts of debt, agreements signed in the name of development, but crafted to ensure dependence. They fear him because he said enough. Enough to bases built to protect foreign interests, while the blood of his people watered their own soil. Enough to a system that pretended to aid but only enslaved. Enough to the idea that leadership in Africa must always be validated abroad before IT is recognized at home. He said no, no to colonial flags flying above sovereign skies, no to the manipulation of resources meant to feed the continent but funneled into the wallets of others. This young man understood something that many have feared to say out loud, that true freedom cannot be outsourced. IT cannot be granted by those who profit from your oppression. True freedom is taken. IT is seized in the mind before IT is seized in reality. And when he spoke, he did not speak as a politician chasing popularity. He spoke as a warrior within a system built to fail the very people he now champions. They fear him because he called out the lies. He unmasked the true nature of global agreements that sound like cooperation but smell like control. In his voice, the people heard what they had long forgotten, the tone of a leader who is not negotiating on behalf of his people but fighting for them. The courage to stand up to former masters is rare, but what is even rarer is to do IT not for power, but for purpose. He chose not to bow. And when you do not bow to systems built to ensure your submission, those systems begin to tremble. They fear this young leader because he turned his back on the playbook that has governed African politics for decades. He refused to be a mere symbol. He refused to attend meetings where the script is written by those who never lived a day under the sun of his nation. He rejected the theater of diplomacy where the actors speak of peace while profiting from conflict. He walked away from chairs at tables that only offered crumbs and demanded that Africa bake its own bread. They fear him because his actions have created a ripple effect. When one leader rises in truth, others begin to question their silence. When one man speaks boldly, others begin to listen more closely. He has become a signal in the darkness, a reminder that it is possible to lead without selling your people, possible to rise without bowing, possible to say no to the old order and yes to a future defined by US for US. This is why they fear him, not because he is armed, but because he is awake, because he awakens others, because in him they see a future where Africa is no longer a dependent but a decider. No longer a land to be exploited, but a continent to be revered. They fear that his defiance is contagious, that his bravery is a flame that will spread from one capital to another, from one village to every corner of this continent. They fear him because he is the beginning of an end, the end of a system that has survived only through our submission. And when a system built on control meets a man who cannot be controlled, it begins to panic. It begins to crumble. They fear this young leader because he spoke truth to power without fear. They fear him because he refused to whisper where others murmured. He chose to raise his voice in the midst of silence, to speak where others would stay silent, to confront the beast that feeds on the blood of Africa's future. He understood that to liberate a people, one must first liberate their minds. And to liberate the mind, you must dare to speak the truth, even if your voice shakes, even if your life is on the line, even if the powers that be mock your name. He knew that truth is not a weapon of the weak, but a shield of the righteous. He knew that when you stand before power with nothing but the sword of truth, you stand taller than armies. And he stood, young, unbowed, unbroken, speaking words that cut through the lies wrapped in diplomatic smiles. He spoke not to please but to awaken, not to negotiate but to liberate. He exposed the rot, the deception, the empty promises of foreign partners who have mastered the art of pillaging while smiling. And he spoke this truth not in secret rooms, but on platforms that shook the ground beneath those who thought Africa would always be silent. They fear him because he spoke what millions could only whisper. He spoke of sovereignty, of dignity, of the right to decide one's destiny without foreign fingers on the map. He questioned the presence of foreign military bases, the signing of mineral contracts that enrich others while African children study under trees. He pointed a firm finger at the institutions that claim to aid but only ensure control. He called out the looting of gold, the theft of uranium, the exploitation of land, and he did so without blinking. And that is why they fear him, because when a young man stands in front of power and says, "We see you," the game changes. When a young man says, "We will no longer be your laboratory, your mine, your military outpost," the room grows silent. Because truth shatters the illusion of control, and this young leader, with every word, every speech, every declaration, has been shattering that illusion, they fear him because he did not wrap his words in cowardice. He called imperialism by its name. He called neocolonialism by its name. He called out the foreign powers who fund wars in one breath and speak of peace in the next. He challenged the idea that Africa must always ask, always beg, always wait. He looked into the eyes of those who think they own this continent and told them, "You do not." He spoke with the authority of a man who owes his loyalty to the dust of his homeland, not to the chairs of foreign conferences. They fear him because in every word he speaks there is fire, a fire that is igniting the spirits of young Africans from the Nile to the Congo, from the Sahel to the Cape, a fire that burns away fear, that burns away submission. A fire that tells the young man in a village, the young woman in a city, that they too can rise, they too can speak. They too can refuse to be tools of systems designed to destroy them, and this fire cannot be contained. They fear him because his truth has spread beyond borders, beyond languages, beyond limits, because when truth is spoken with courage, it becomes a movement. When truth is spoken by a leader who lives what he says, it becomes a revolution. And they know this. They have seen what happens when Africa begins to believe in itself again. They remember those who stood before, the ones who dared, the ones who dreamed, the ones who died for this continent to live. And they know that this young man is of that same spirit. They fear him because he spoke truth to power, and that truth is now marching. IT is marching in the hearts of the youth. IT is marching in the songs of the streets. IT is marching in the eyes of mothers who refuse to mourn another generation to slavery. IT is marching unstoppable, uncompromising, unafraid. And that is why they fear this young leader. because his voice is no longer just his. IT is the voice of a people who have found their words, their power, and their purpose. They fear this young leader because he did not only rise for his own nation, he stood as a voice for the voiceless across the continent. He understood that the struggle of one African is the struggle of all Africans. He knew that oppression does not respect borders, and that the hand that bleeds Burkina Faso is the same that suffocates Mali, that loots Niger, that divides Sudan, that destabilizes the Congo. And because he knew this, he chose not to stand alone. He chose to stand with others, and they fear him for that. They fear him because he dared to unite a fragmented people. He dared to bridge the gulf that was deliberately carved between Francophone and Anglophone, between North and Sub-Saharan, between the franc, the dollar, and the shilling. He saw through the lines that were drawn not by African hands, but by colonial pens. And he spoke a language that cut through them all, the language of dignity, the language of resistance, the language of one Africa. When he stood beside leaders in the region, he spoke not of isolation, but of integration, not of dependence, but of cooperation, not of begging, but of building together. He envisioned a block of nations that would rise from the ashes of neocolonial control and declare to the world that Africa is not a continent to be controlled, but a people to be respected. He knew that our individual freedoms mean nothing if our neighbors remain in chains, and so he fought for regional unity. He fought for the idea that the struggle is collective, that Africa must speak with one voice to be heard. They fear him because he broke the narrative. He refused to be a servant to foreign interests and refused to be used to fight his brothers. He refused to be a silent partner in the strategy of divide and rule, where others were coerced to turn against their neighbors in exchange for aid and weapons. He stood in defiance. He said, "If my neighbor is free, then I am stronger. If my brother is liberated, then I am safer." He built bridges where they built walls, and that terrified those who profit from our division. He united the voices of the youth who have been lied to, used, and forgotten. He spoke to them not as a politician, but as one of their own. He told them that they are not hopeless, that their future is not limited to crossing the Mediterranean in search of dignity. He told them that the continent of gold, of diamonds, of oil, of talent is theirs. He awakened a Pan-African dream that many feared was dead, and when he spoke, he reawakened the spirit of resistance that sleeps in the heart of every oppressed soul. They fear him because he took the battle from one nation to many. He refused to be caged by national borders and chose to inspire a generation across the continent. They hear him in the ghettos of Nairobi, in the townships of South Africa, in the markets of Dakar, in the campuses of Lagos. They hear him and they begin to stand straighter, to question louder, to believe harder. His courage is contagious, and that is what they fear most. Not just his words, but the way his words move others. This young leader did not only stand against foreign dominance, he stood against the system that turns leaders into puppets. He stood against the ideology that tells Africans to be grateful for poverty as long as there is peace. He stood against the lies we have been told, that unity is impossible, that our differences are too great, that we need others to think for us, speak for us, rule over us. And when he stood against these lies, he did not do it with hatred. He did it with love for a people who have been forced to forget their greatness. They fear him because in uniting the voices of the oppressed, he has become the symbol of what is possible. He is not just a president. He is a reflection of the African future they never wanted to see. A future where leaders rise from the people and speak to the people, not as masters, but as servants of the dream. A future where the struggle in one country is not a footnote, but a chapter in the story of our continental rebirth. And that future, my friends, is already knocking at the door. The wind is shifting. The ground is trembling. The children of Africa are awakening, and they fear him because he has become the drumbeat to which that awakening marches. They fear this young leader because he broke the script. He was never meant to speak with such conviction, to stand with such defiance, to look the global powers in the eye and say, "No more." He was meant to comply, to be a good student of their political manual, to nod, to sign, to smile, to accept their conditions. He was supposed to thank them for the chains, to kiss the hand that robbed his people, to smile for cameras while his nation bled in silence. But instead, he did the unthinkable. He refused. And because he refused, they panic, they scramble, they scratch their heads in meeting rooms where the fate of African countries is decided without a single African present. They cannot understand how a man who sat in their military schools, who trained under their doctrines, who could have been molded to serve their interests, now stands as an unbreakable wall against their greed. And it is this that shakes them. For every string they pulled, he cut 3. For every offer they made, he stood silent. For every threat, he grew louder. This young leader is feared because he recognized the script of colonial control wrapped in the cloak of development. He recognized that aid with conditions is not aid as a trap, that loans packaged with smiles but tied to privatization, to mineral rights, to military bases, are chains in new colors. He knew that every time a country signs away its resources for peanuts in the name of partnership, the people lose twice, once in dignity and again in poverty. He recognized the game, and he walked away from the table. They fear him because he challenged the notion that African countries cannot decide for themselves. He said no to military dependence, no to economic strangulation, no to foreign dictates wrapped in democratic terminology. He said Africa must be free, truly free, free to determine its own future, free to trade on its own terms, free to defend its own land without outside orders. He said that freedom without sovereignty is an illusion, and sovereignty that depends on outside approval is a mockery. They fear him because his courage exposes their lies. They have long said that African nations need guidance, that without their support, Africa would collapse, that their hand in our economy, in our politics, in our security, is a necessity. But this young man stood up and functioned without them. He replaced foreign troops with national pride. He replaced dependent agreements with self-reliance. He broke the myth that we cannot survive without the very hands that have been draining U.S. And for this they are terrified. This is why the media machine begins to whir when he speaks, why they label him a dictator, a danger, a disturbance to peace. They use the same words they used for every African who dared to think independently. They fear him because they cannot control him, because their calls go unanswered, because their threats are returned with silence. They do not fear a leader who complies. They fear one who thinks, who questions, who rejects their script entirely, and his rejection is not rooted in hatred, but in love. Love for his people, love for their land, love for a future in which Africans can stand without begging. His words are not aimed to insult, but to awaken. He knows that you cannot plant your feet firmly if the ground you stand on belongs to another. You cannot call yourself free while signing agreements that leave your people hungry, that export your future, that rent your sovereignty. And so they fear him because he reclaims that sovereignty. He takes back the keys to a house that was always ours, locked with foreign chains. He rips the veil off the modern colonial structure, and he tells his people we are enough. We have enough. We can be enough. If we believe in ourselves and reject the chains of mental and economic slavery, then no empire can stop U.S. They fear him because his defiance is proof that Africa is not helpless. That the day a leader loves his people more than power, more than money, more than the smiling visits from foreign diplomats, that day the ground shifts, that day the chains rattle, that day the system trembles.